A $35 million Apache helicopter sat dead on the tarmac. The manufacturer's best engineers had been working for 3 days straight, running every test, replacing every part, checking every sensor. Everything read normal, but the engine wouldn't spool past 50%. They were about to give up and ship it back to depot when the commander made one last call. An old man arrived in faded coveralls carrying a beat-up toolbox from the Vietnam era. The engineers laughed, but what happened in the next 20 minutes left them speechless and changed military training forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The AH-64 Apache helicopter sat silent on the flight line, like a wounded predator, its rotor blades still under the merciless desert sun. Around it, a circle of engineers from the manufacturer huddled in frustrated conversation, their clipboards and diagnostic tablets offering nothing but dead ends. They'd been there for 3 days, 3 days of troubleshooting, 3 days of recalibrating sensors, 3 days of running every protocol in the manual, and the engine remained as lifeless as the day it quit mid-flight. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to an Apache, not to a machine worth $35 million, designed to survive combat zones and extreme conditions. Yet here it was, grounded, useless, and taking an entire squadron's readiness down with it. The air smelled of jet fuel and desperation. You could feel it in the way the younger mechanics avoided eye contact, in the way the senior engineers kept glancing at their phones, waiting for a miracle or a scapegoat, whichever came first. Reputations were unraveling in real time. The manufacturer's team had flown in with confidence, assured that their expertise would have the bird back in the air within hours. Now they were whispering about shipping the entire engine back to the depot, a process that would take weeks, maybe months. The mission timeline was collapsing. The commander knew it. Everyone knew it. That's when he walked onto the tarmac, jaw set, eyes scanning the scene with the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said a name, Webb. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Webb. A few of the older crew chiefs looked up sharply, recognition flickering across their faces. Within the hour, the man himself arrived, not in a pressed uniform or with a corporate badge, but in faded coveralls, carrying a battered toolbox that looked like it had survived more deployments than most soldiers. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for a briefing. He just walked straight to the engine, placed one weathered hand on the cowling, and stood there in silence, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The manufacturer's lead engineer pulled up the diagnostic readout on his tablet for what must have been the 20th time that morning. Every parameter was green. Fuel pressure nominal. Ignition sequencing perfect. Turbine temperature sensors all within spec. The digital logs told a story of a flawless machine that simply refused to perform. They'd swapped out the fuel control unit, replaced the electronic engine control, recalibrated the FADEC system twice, run ground tests until the battery packs needed charging, and still when they hit the starter, the engine would begin its spool-up sequence, climb to about 50% power, then plateau, hovering in that mechanical purgatory between life and death, unable to commit to either. Hours had turned into days. The team had cycled through every troubleshooting tree in the technical manual, then started inventing new ones. They'd brought in additional equipment, contacted specialists back at headquarters, even arranged a video call with the original design engineers. Everyone had a theory. No one had an answer. The frustration was becoming visible now. Tight shoulders, clipped responses. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical work but from intellectual defeat. These weren't amateurs. These were some of the best aviation technicians in the industry. Men and women who'd spent careers inside turbine engines, who could recite tolerance specifications in their sleep. And there, at the edge of the work area, stood Webb. He hadn't moved much since arriving, hadn't offered suggestions or asked to see the data. He just watched, occasionally walking a slow circle around the aircraft, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable behind decades of sun-weathered lines. To the younger engineers, he looked like exactly what he was, a relic, someone from an era before computerized diagnostics, before real-time telemetry, before engines talked to satellites. One of them muttered something about old-school guesswork not being helpful here. Another suggested politely that perhaps the veteran would be more comfortable waiting in the shade. They had this handled. They just needed more time, more data, more something they hadn't thought of yet. But what if the answer wasn't in the data at all? Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Webb, retired, though everyone who'd served with him just called him Chief. The coveralls he wore weren't the crisp, company-issued kind the manufacturer's team had on. They were faded olive drab, stained with decades of hydraulic fluid, engine oil, and the kind of grime that never fully washes out. His toolbox looked like an artifact from another era, battered aluminum covered in unit patches and hand-scratched labels. Inside weren't the precision torque wrenches and digital multimeters the modern crew relied on. These were tools that had been modified, adapted, some even hand-forged in field workshops when the right equipment wasn't available. Each one had a story. Each one had saved a mission. Webb had spent 28 years keeping helicopters in the air. Most of that time in places where send it back to depot wasn't an option. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Bosnia. Places where a downed bird meant stranded troops. Failed extractions, lives hanging in the balance. He'd learned to listen to engines the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, not just for what the instruments said, but for what they couldn't measure. Rhythm, hesitation, the subtle wrongness that numbers miss. There was a story about him that still circulated in certain veteran circles, the kind of tale that gets embellished over beers but remains fundamentally true. It was 1972, somewhere in the Central Highlands. His Huey had taken ground fire during an emergency medevac. Nothing catastrophic, just a few rounds through the engine compartment. But when they tried to spool up for dust-off, the turbine screamed and then choked, power dying at 70%. They were in a hot LZ, enemy closing in, wounded on board, and the engine was giving them nothing. The pilot was already calling for backup extraction, preparing to abandon the aircraft. Webb had other ideas. While rounds snapped through the trees overhead, he climbed onto the engine deck with nothing but a flashlight, a wrench, and the kind of calm that terrifies people more than panic would. He traced fuel lines by hand, feeling for pressure inconsistencies, checked the compressor blades for damage the instruments couldn't detect, found a severed linkage, a tiny mechanical rod that the diagnostic systems had no way of monitoring, because it was purely mechanical, a backup system from an older design iteration. He jury-rigged a replacement using safety wire and a piece of scrap aluminum, reinstalled the cowling, and signaled the pilot. The engine spooled to full power. They lifted off with 30 seconds to spare. That Huey flew another 6 missions that week before anyone realized what was holding the fuel control together. Webb didn't ask permission. He simply set down his toolbox, pulled out a flashlight, the old kind, heavy aluminum with a lens yellowed by age, and began his examination. Not at the computer terminals or diagnostic stations, but at the engine itself. He ran his hand along the intake housing, fingers moving slowly, deliberately, like a sculptor assessing marble. He crouched low, angling the flashlight beam across seams and joints, looking for something the sensors couldn't see. The engineers watched with thinly veiled irritation. One of them checked his watch. Another exchanged a glance with his colleague that said everything. "This is a waste of time." The lead engineer finally spoke up, his patience exhausted. "Chief, we've already done a complete visual inspection. We've run borescope imaging through every accessible section. If there was visible damage, we'd have found it." His tone was professional but firm, the kind of courtesy extended to someone right before you escort them out. Webb didn't respond, didn't even look up, just kept moving around the engine, occasionally tapping a surface with his knuckle, listening. The tension was becoming unbearable. The commander stood with arms crossed, watching, trusting his instinct, but feeling the weight of judgment from the manufacturer's team. This was his call, his reputation. If the veteran came up empty, it wouldn't just embarrass Webb. It would make the commander look desperate, superstitious, willing to gamble mission readiness on folklore. The chief warrant officer from the manufacturer finally stepped forward, voice low but edged with authority. "Sir, with respect, we need to move forward with the depot plan. We can't afford to—" "There!" Webb's voice cut through the standoff like a blade, quiet but absolute. He was crouched near the lower section of the engine mount, flashlight held at an acute angle, creating shadows across a surface that had been inspected a dozen times. He didn't move, didn't elaborate, just held the light steady. The engineers approached skeptically, bending to look where his beam pointed. At first they saw nothing. The metal looked perfect. No discoloration, no obvious deformation. Then Webb shifted the angle slightly, and there it was. A hairline fracture so fine it was nearly invisible, running along a stressed junction point. The crack wouldn't show up on digital logs because it hadn't yet compromised fuel flow or electrical continuity. But it was flexing under load, creating micro-vibrations that disrupted the turbine's ability to achieve full spool. The kind of failure that doesn't announce itself through sensors. The kind only experience knows to look for. They brought in a magnification scope, the kind used for precision welding inspections. Under 10 times magnification, the crack became undeniable. A jagged fissure propagating through a high-stress junction that bore the engine's full operational load during spool-up. It explained everything. Why the engine climbed to 50% then stalled. Why every sensor read normal. Why 3 days of diagnostics had yielded nothing. The failure was mechanical, analog, invisible to the digital systems that modern aviation had come to trust absolutely. Webb had found it in 20 minutes using a flashlight and 4 decades of scar tissue disguised as knowledge. The repair took 6 hours. They had to carefully grind out the damaged section, apply a precision weld, then retorque the entire mount assembly to specification. Webb supervised but didn't interfere. This was their expertise and he respected it. When they finally ran the startup sequence, the turbine spooled smoothly past 50%, past 70%, climbed to full military power without hesitation. The sound was beautiful, clean, strong, purposeful. The kind of sound that means readiness, that means mission capability restored. A few of the younger mechanics actually cheered. Word traveled fast. By evening, a 4-star general had arrived on the flight line. The kind of visit that doesn't happen for routine maintenance. He found Webb repacking his toolbox, preparing to leave as quietly as he'd come. The general didn't send an aide. He walked over himself, came to attention, and rendered a salute that held more weight than ceremony. They remembered the story from Vietnam, the Huey under fire, the jury-rigged repair, the 6 missions flown on safety wire and ingenuity. Webb returned the salute, no words necessary. Recognition between warriors doesn't require speeches. The engineers stood at a distance, watching. A few looked humbled, others thoughtful. One of the younger technicians approached Webb before he left, asked if he could see inside that battered toolbox, maybe learn what the old tools were for. Webb smiled, the first expression anyone had seen from him all day, and opened it. "They're for listening," he said simply. "Everything else is just confirmation." The general filed his report that same night, recommending immediate implementation of what he called legacy knowledge integration. Within a month, the training program began. They didn't call it old-school troubleshooting or legacy maintenance procedures. Those terms carried the wrong connotation, implied something obsolete being preserved out of nostalgia. Instead, the official course title was Advanced Tactile Diagnostics and Intuitive Engineering, and it filled up immediately. Chief warrant officers, senior mechanics, even a few of the manufacturer's engineers signed up. Men and women who'd spent careers trusting screens suddenly found themselves sitting in a hangar classroom, learning to trust their hands. Webb taught them to feel temperature differentials across metal surfaces that indicated stress points, to recognize the acoustic signature of a bearing beginning to fail, not the obvious grinding, but the subtle change in harmonic frequency that preceded it by weeks. To understand that silence sometimes speaks louder than alarms, that the absence of expected vibration can be more diagnostic than its presence. He showed them how to map an engine's personality, the idiosyncrasies that made each airframe subtly different, despite identical specifications. The younger mechanics struggled at first. They kept reaching for their tablets, wanting to correlate what they felt with what the data said. Webb would gently push the devices aside. "The machine will tell you," he'd say, guiding a student's hand along a fuel line. "But only if you're listening. Feel that micro-flutter? It's talking." Slowly, hesitantly, they began to hear it. The language their tools had been translating for them all along, now spoken directly. It wasn't about replacing technology. It was about remembering what technology was built to measure in the first place. The Apache returned to full operational status. The manufacturer updated their training protocols, and somewhere in the manual's revision notes, buried in technical language about supplementary inspection procedures, was the ghost of Marcus Webb's flashlight and his weathered hands. But the real impact wasn't captured in any manual. It lived in the mechanics who now paused before running diagnostics, who placed their palms against engine cowlings and listened. In the young engineer who caught a hydraulic failure 2 weeks later, using nothing but the wrong kind of quiet. In the slow, deliberate way, experienced technicians began mentoring the next generation. Not just teaching procedures, but passing down instinct. There's a lesson here that reaches far beyond helicopters and turbines. In every field, every profession, there are quiet masters. People whose expertise can't be quantified in certifications or captured in software. They're the ones who've made every mistake, survived every edge case, developed intuition through 10,000 hours of focused attention, and too often we dismiss them. We trust the dashboard over the driver, the algorithm over the practitioner, the latest methodology over hard-won wisdom. Do you know someone like Chief Webb in your world? The veteran teacher who understands students in ways standardized tests never will. The tradesperson who can diagnose a problem before the inspection report is complete? The quiet expert everyone calls when the modern solutions fail? Maybe it's time to listen to them, to learn from them before that knowledge walks away. If this story resonated with you, share it. Drop a comment about the masters in your field, the ones who taught you to trust more than the tools. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this that need telling. More lessons hiding in the places we've stopped looking. The last anyone saw of Webb that day, he was walking across the tarmac toward the parking lot, toolbox in hand, the setting sun casting his shadow long across the flight line. He didn't look back at the Apache, now humming with life behind him. He'd done what he came to do. The machine was flying. The knowledge was passed on. Some legacies don't need monuments. They just need someone willing to listen when experience speaks.